Good morning. 1 Kings 3 is a good place to turn, best place to turn, as we continue looking at, well, not David anymore, but Solomon now. In our study of David and Solomon, this is lesson 9 already. And as we noticed, I guess maybe in one of the first lessons, people are, in history, they are remembered for different reasons. Some of them, the ones who are remembered anyway, are remembered for different reasons. Abraham, for instance, in the Bible, Abraham was remembered for his faith. He's known as a man of faith. In fact, he's known as, in a way, the father of the faithful. Samson. What's Samson remembered for, besides his hair? Strength. Solomon is remembered, I'm not even going to ask because it's on the screen, and he's remembered for his wisdom, among other things. I could probably think of a few others, but as a rule, as far as the Scripture narrative is concerned, one of the things that is emphasized more than others is his wisdom. After he became the king of Israel, he listened to the advice of his father, David, and dealt with the people who were a threat to the stability of the kingdom, and especially his reign. We looked at that last week. But more importantly, he sought God's advice or guidance in leading the nation. He needed God's help, but he knew that he needed God's help, and he asked for God's help. And he could have asked for anything. He could have asked for health. He could have asked for wealth. He could have asked for even more power than he already had as a king. He could have asked, for the borders of Israel to be extended, beyond, farther beyond what they ever had been. But he didn't ask for any of those things. He asked very humbly. He asked in a humble way, "Give your servant an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people?" Well, God was pleased with that request. He wanted, again, according to that translation, an understanding mind to govern the people. That's a pretty good trait for a leader of any people to have, an understanding mind to govern them, to discern between good and evil, maybe even more important. That also reflects his desire to heed what his dad said long before. He who rules over men must be just or righteous, rule in the fear of God. 2 Samuel 23, verse 3. And so as Solomon began his reign, that is what he clearly intended to do. He wanted to reign righteously, and he showed himself to want to do that in the fear of God because he approached God and asked God for help in doing that. Well, in our lesson text here, which is chapter 3 of 1 Kings, we see a reference to some of Solomon's legacy, his great building projects, especially the temple. That's why sometimes it's referred to as Solomon's temple, because it was built under Solomon's administration. Same reason that the temple that Jesus frequented and the temple that the people of Jesus' day was sometimes called Herod's temple. Same site, same structure to an extent, but Herod made it even more, built upon it even more, and so it was called Herod's temple. But they were both, at that time, at both of those times, considered God's temple, the house of God. So Solomon was going to build it for the first time. We also see his wisdom on display. And despite his failures, he at this point knew the importance of relying on God. Psalm 72, verses 1 and 2, a psalm of Solomon. "Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May He judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. Similar to what he asked for in 1 Kings chapter 3. So because he asked for God's help, he was blessed. And he was blessed abundantly by God. So, let's look at the first 3 verses, which tells us about Solomon the builder. One of his, again, this part of his legacy. But we're also going to notice some things that aren't the focus of the narrative, and so we may just pass right over them without thinking. It says, Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of Jehovah and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of Jehovah. Solomon loved Jehovah, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. So, we already saw in chapter 2 how he began his reign by dispensing justice to those who deserved justice. Adonijah, his brother, who started a rebellion, and then presumed to apparently try to start the same thing again in another way. Abiathar the priest, Joab, Shimei, and because the new king knew how to deal with those enemies, it says in verse 46, the end of chapter 2, that the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. And so now that he's dealt with those threats, we read the very next thing that he did, or that's recorded, is that he made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. We touched on that last week about how one of his notable traits in his legacy was that he had so many wives in addition to concubines, and that those marriages would basically, for the most part, be about alliances, making allies, joining families, which is all about increasing your power, or at least your leverage and stance. Well, that's what we read about him doing here. He made a marriage alliance. And he made that marriage alliance with Pharaoh. Now, historically speaking, that's the king of Egypt. Historically speaking, what's the significance of Egypt and Pharaoh in the context of the Hebrew people? Okay. You rewind a few hundred years, a couple hundred years, and Egypt was the great superpower, and still was, for the most part, historically the great superpower of the world at this time. In Bible history, I guess past Genesis 11 anyway, one way that you can divide history or remember it is by who was the power at that time. So it used to be Egypt. And in addition to being the superpower of the world at that time, they were also the number one enemies of Israel because they were owned by Egypt. Not just owned in a partnership way, but they were slaves in Egypt. And it got very dirty. It got very ugly near the end. And then Moses was called, and he and Aaron went in there, and all the Exodus narrative unfolded. And we rarely hear about Egypt again in the sense of rising up against Israel. Well, now Solomon, the king of Egypt, or the king of Israel, is making a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Now, it's significant for a couple reasons. First of all, because it shows, and it's probably one of the purposes here, other than just recording it as a fact, Egypt apparently didn't normally do this kind of thing. They were in the position of power. They took maybe daughters from other places to marry to their sons, but they did not give their daughters in marriage to other people's sons. But they did that here, which shows in a subtle way just how prominent the power of Solomon was, and his influence and the power of the nation growing, because Egypt is now, we see them giving a daughter to marriage to this shepherd people that they despised just a couple or a few centuries ago. So that's one thing. The other thing is, what about what God commanded the people through Moses? Let's take Exodus 34, for instance, verses 11 through 16. God said, "Take care, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go. And when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you're invited, you eat of his sacrifice, and you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, and make your sons whore after their gods. Take care, lest you make a covenant with them." Now, yes, he was talking about the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, but wouldn't that apply to Egypt too? Same exact thing. They are idolaters, pagans who worship false gods. Well, Deuteronomy 7, he reiterated that same point. It says, "When Jehovah your God brings you into the land that you're entering and clears away many nations before you, you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of Jehovah would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly." That's what God said just a couple centuries before. Very specific. Do not intermarry with these pagan, idolatrous peoples. And he could have just stopped there, but he even gave the reason. He said, because they will turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. And then I'm going to have to treat you. I'll treat you just the way I treat them. Once you become like they are, I will treat you like I treated them for the same reason. So even though it's not emphasized here, this is the way the Old Testament narrative works more often than not. We know what God has said about this kind of thing. Now the text says that Solomon did that. The text doesn't have to say he shouldn't have done that, because God has already said, you should not do this. So the text doesn't say he sinned in this, but that doesn't mean he didn't sin by doing this, because we already know that God said that is, do not do that, and he did it. So this is going to come back to play in Solomon's life. And there are other applications we can make from this as well. Another part of this is that the people were sacrificing at the high places. Well, had God said anything about that in the past? Yeah. Same thing as he said about what we just read. He said simply, don't do it. Don't sacrifice at the high. What were the high places anyway? Okay, there's two answers, I guess, two possible answers. One is exactly what they're called. They're high places. They're places that are high. I mean, that's literally what they were. But they had a deeper significance. That's where idolaters traditionally went to make their sacrifices to their idols. I guess the thought process was the higher you can get, the closer you are to them. So the more likely they are to see you or hear you or whatever. So they would go to these high places and sacrifice to their idols. So God said, I don't want you sacrificing even to me at those high places. That's how separated he wanted them to be from the practices of their religious neighbors was, I don't even want you to use their places. And somebody might say, well, come on, God, they've got an altar here already and everything. I mean, convenience, and it's a pretty nice altar, or I don't know, anything like that. God said, do not use those places to sacrifice. Now, the verse here seems to suggest, or it could be easily taken to mean that they were justified in doing that because there was no temple yet. But that we can't rush to judgment on that. It's simply saying that was, I guess, their justification of why they were doing that. Or the writer, at least, is explaining there was no house yet built, So as yet, they were sacrificing at the high places. Well, God had already ordained the tabernacle. That's been in institution for as long as Moses, since Moses was the prophet, primary prophet of God. But I guess there was this strange transition period where, since the design of the tabernacle was to be taken down and then rebuilt every time they stopped, now that they're in the land, it's like, okay, well, now what? Well, it seems to me that the natural thing would be to build the tabernacle just like always, except now you don't have to move it anymore because you're not moving anymore. But apparently that's not what was done. At least it wasn't considered by David to be enough. So David, the part that we kind of skipped over, I guess, in this study was David wanted to build a house for God, a permanent one. But God said, no. He said more than that, but he also said, I'll let your son do it. That's a short version. We'll see a little bit more of that in just a second. So, the temple is arguably one of Solomon's greatest achievements, or what he's known for. It does perhaps show devotion to God at that time. And it was at least going to help the people to not sacrifice at the high places anymore. But we read in verse 3 that even Solomon did it. Solomon himself was using the high places for sacrifices and offerings. So he loved Jehovah, but he too was doing something that God had said don't do. The text points out, or the lesson points out, that Israel was supposed to worship in the place that God would choose. Deuteronomy 12 says, as I said earlier, that they were to destroy all the places where the nations served their gods, on the mountains and on the hills and under every green tree, because that was unacceptable, what they were doing now, because they had been told that. But they were to worship, verse 5, in the place where God chose. And then the lesson says the temple was this place. I have a little bit of an issue with that, because when we look at 2 Samuel 7, what God's response to David is basically, he tells Nathan, go to David, I got a message for him. It's like, I heard you want to build a house for me. And then he says, and I'll paraphrase, at what point in the long history of the Hebrews so far did I ever look at any man and say, why haven't you built a house for me? That is a rhetorical question, and the answer is obvious. That is about as sarcastic as you'll ever see a quote of God get. And what he means is, I never did. And because I never did, wouldn't that seem to suggest I don't want that? If I wanted it, I would have said, build one. But what he tells David is, I've never said I wanted that, because I don't want that. I made the tabernacle, basically. In 2 Samuel 7, verses 7 and 9, he said, in all places I have moved with all the people of Israel wherever they went. And I think what some people do is interpret what God was saying to David as, you're right, David, I've been in a tent the whole time, and I should have a house. But it seems pretty clear to me that he's saying the exact opposite of that. This is the way I said it should be, and this is the way I've done it. I never told anybody I wanted them to build me a house of cedar and whatever else. And what God basically is doing is saying, but if you insist, okay, fine, but you're not going to do it. You got enough on your plate. You've had all kinds of wars going on, and you've been, putting out fires all over the place. When your son takes over, he'll do it, because he won't have any of those things. There's going to be peace, there's going to be tranquility, at least for a time. So he'll do it then. So I hesitate to say that the temple was the place that God had said and intended all along to be the place where the nation of Israel would come to make their sacrifices, because I don't think that is at all what the Scriptures say. But it did ultimately become the place where the Hebrews would make their sacrifices. Certainly not on the high places and on the mountains and the hills. Yep.
It seems to me that people have a tendency to worship the things or the blessings that God gives them instead of the giver of the blessings. When you look at Abraham, God gave Abraham a living son, which when God does something in the human aspect, that's what he wants, is us. It's not whatever we can build with our hands or something cold or whatever.
Yeah.
And so Abraham, if ever there was somebody who would have said, well, thank you for this son. I'm going to protect him. I'm going to keep him. When God said, give him back, it's like, here it goes. Whereas whatever blessings we get, we want to accumulate, save,
Yeah.
instead of recognizing that it all comes from the hand of God.
Yeah, and there's also the idea that, the way God ordained for something to be should be more valuable to us than anything else. So you see, in other words, if they had built the tabernacle exactly to specification per God's law in Jerusalem, right there in the same spot where the temple was going to be built, except just built the tabernacle exactly as God his very detailed instructions, that would have been the most beautiful thing it could have been, because that was God's exact specifications with the exact materials, the exact layout, exactly as God instructed. But the way David looked at it was, this is just an old tent. And wouldn't it be better if we built it of cedar and just made it all extravagant with, overlaid with gold or whatever? You see, his intentions were good. He wanted to make it as beautiful as was worthy of God's glory, and at least as beautiful as his own house seems to be what he was really comparing it to. He's like, look, I've got this beautiful house of cedar and all this. God's in a tent. This is not right. So his heart was in the right place, but at the same time, they missed the point a little bit. God's way is always the best. It's more beautiful. And we can apply that to our lives very easily. If you think about the way some people consider the way a house of worship ought to look and whatnot, and the more intricate and beautiful it is to the human eye, the more holy it is, I would beg to differ. Those things do not equate with one another. Do you have something?
Well, it's what David was told. Also, I kept him when he goes, don't you know that to obey is better than sacrifice? Which means, yes, it was built the same way because they obeyed what God told them to do. It was not the resulting thing. It was that they were honoring him by obeying him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which made it more important. Yes, Jam? Mm-hmm.
And see, I've been to many churches. I've been to so many churches that I've seen what's going on. And the biggest thing is when it comes to worshiping God, like we should be, I'm finding many churches just to be not doing that. They're worshiping what God gave them, not what God is giving.
Yeah.
Because like he just said, we should be worshiping the giver, not the stuff that we were given.
Yep.
And it's like, I want that to stop. Because that's not what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be worshiping the giver.
Mm-hmm.
The way I look at it is, if you're going to worship the stuff he gives you, then you aren't in church. That's just, you are just there to pick what you want.
Yep. We always have to make sure that we're focused on God and not just the things that God's given us. Thank Him for the blessings that we have rather than getting caught up on the blessings. And, ultimately the Jews, what they ended up doing was basically worshiping the temple instead of, understanding that it was the place where God dwelt for that time. They started worshiping, caring more about it than the God that dwelt there. And it got them in a lot of spiritual trouble and had a lot to do with their hard-heartedness about obeying God in general. So after the builder part, we see Solomon, the prayer. In verses 4 through 15, it says, "The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar." Again, 2 references to Solomon doing something that God had said not to do. At Gibeon, Jehovah appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, "Ask what I shall give you." Let me go ahead and clarify once again. This does not indicate that God said this to Solomon because of how much he was pleased with the offerings that Solomon made on the altar at the high place. That does not follow from this. It may just be that God totally overlooked the whole sacrifices on the altar at the high place, and God saying this to Solomon had nothing to do with that. Because again, this was a period where God had to overlook many things in patience and long-suffering. So lest we understand this to mean that God was so pleased with Solomon's offerings on the pagan altar at the great high place that he said, "Okay, I can't resist any longer because I love those sacrifices so much. Ask and I'll give you anything." But he just asked that because he's God and Solomon was his chosen king to succeed David. So verse 6 says, Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Jehovah my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this your great people?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, "Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days." And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. Okay, so this is where Solomon asks for wisdom. We already pointed it out, so we won't look at it too much more other than, again, an understanding mind to govern your people and to discern good and evil. Discern between good and evil. And that did please the Lord. That did please God, that he asked for that. And because of that, as the story goes that we all know so well, he gave him not only what he asked for, he gave him what he didn't ask for. He gave him wealth. He said he would give him lengthened days. However, these things were conditioned. They were conditional. In verse 14, A big if. If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And when he woke up, ironically, it says that he came to Jerusalem and stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and he offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings there. Not the high place. He was already at the great high place. Now he went to Jerusalem and offered these before the Ark of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. I think that's significant. Why the change? Well, it probably has something to do with what just transpired. But what we're seeing with him is that he asked for wisdom. He could have asked for anything, but he asked for it because he was humble enough to say, I have no idea what I'm doing. He wasn't actually a little child, but that's what he's referring to himself like that. I'm like a little child. I don't know how to do anything. I don't know how to go out or come in. Anything. I don't even know how to do that much. So how in the world am I going to govern a people like your people? So please give me an understanding mind so that I can discern between good and evil. That's what God gave him. Which leads us to the last thing, Solomon the Wise. And here's just a little sampling of his wisdom. This is probably the most notorious judgment case of any ever recorded. There were two women who were prostitutes who came to the king and stood before him. They had a case. This is what people would do when they really have some sort of dispute. They would come before the king's court and present it. And they did it with Moses before, and I mean, this is the way that it always had been, at least in God's people. So, here was the case. The one woman said, this woman and I live in the same house, and we gave birth to a child around the same time. And on the third day after I gave birth, they're 3 days apart, we were alone. There was no one else in the house with us. Only we two were in the house. Verse 19 says, this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. Awful. Tragedy. Probably wasn't that uncommon if she was feeding the baby, in the night and maybe fell asleep. So that's what happened. But it says, this woman comes in and says, but she arose at midnight. When she woke up and realized what had happened, she came into my room with her dead baby. And she took my baby from my bed and put her dead baby in its place. But she said, when I looked at him closely, or she said, when I woke up in the morning to feed the baby, I realized he was dead. And I looked a little bit closer, and I realized, this is not my son. But the other woman said to Solomon the exact opposite. No. The living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. That's what she said before Solomon anyway. The first said, no, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. So that's what was happening in front of Solomon. So imagine Solomon sitting up here, and there's these two women saying, the dead child's yours and the living child's mine. No, the dead child's yours and the living child's mine. No. How in the world can anybody in Solomon's position think to figure that out? How can he possibly know? And even if there was a way to know, how long would it probably take to get to the bottom of it, if it's even possible? It's really impossible. Well, Solomon said basically that same thing. He said, this one says the living son's theirs, the other one says the other thing. How can I, what am I supposed to do? So what he did say was, bring me, just 4 words that probably echoed through that hall to the terror of everybody in there probably. Bring me a sword. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? That's not the words I expected to hear. What is he going to do with a sword in this case? So a sword was brought before the king, and the king said, here's his decision. Cut that baby in half. Give one half to the one, and give the other half to the other. Sounds morbid and harsh. Or maybe Solomon was onto something. Well, here's what ended up happening. It says the woman, and by the way, the writer of 1 Kings doesn't leave it up to the reader to know which one's telling the truth. He goes ahead and tells which one, the living child, who was the mother of the living child right here. He says, the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, no, please don't do that. Give her, she can have the son. She can have the child. Give her the living child. By no means put it, she didn't even say, that's my son, but I'll let her have him. That's probably what I would have said if I was her. If I would have even thought to say that at all, I would have said, I just want everybody to know that I'm telling the truth, that's my son, but I want her to have him instead of being killed. She didn't even say that. She just said, let her have the living child. By no means put him to death. The other woman seemed to suggest she was okay with it. Fine. Whatever the king wants. Now, that sounds crazy. Like, how stupid could she be? Why would she say that? Well, whether she literally said those words or not, she was just going along with the king's judgment. She didn't put up any fight, is the idea. Yeah, her child, see, the writer already told us that the one who was the actual mother of the living child said, don't do it. And this woman was the one whose son had already died. So it wasn't really that much of a sacrifice to her at this point because her son was already dead. But Solomon knew, I say he knew, he at least knew whose child, which woman the child should go to. He also concluded from that she was actually the mother, and he was right. But he at least, the way I see it is, even if she wasn't the child's mother, she proved to be more worthy of the child in the first place. However, that's only because there was literally no possible way to determine who the mother actually was. So this was enough for Solomon to be able to make a ruling. Give the child to that one who said, by no means put him to death. And again, he also discerned from that she is the actual mother, and he was right. So that judgment call on his part, not the judgment call, but the way he came to that is what made the people stand in awe of him. There are a few things, and we're talking about on the spot, right then. Not let's have a short recess or a long recess and let's go into the room and, talk about it for hours on end. Right there, he determined a way to get to the bottom of this. Cut the child in half. Now, what if both of the women would have said, okay? Well, we don't know, because Solomon, I don't know, would he have actually ordered it to be done, or would he have found some other woman to take the baby? We don't know. But the point is, he didn't have to think about that because his decision revealed the true mother. Yes?
It's interesting on that. Like, they both wanted the child, but neither one of them, or one was telling a lie and one was telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought the sword in just to see which one would tell the truth again.
Yeah, it worked.
See, that's the thing where, a mother knows what's going on. They all
Mm-hmm.
to get it. But the other one, when she said, give the live baby to the woman, that's when you knew.
Yep.
That's when David knew.
Yep. He knew as soon as she said that, because that's the only.
It showed the mom that loved that baby.
Yeah, she loved the baby more than herself, because she was willing to let the other woman have him, give up her child. It was wrong. That woman had no claim to her baby, but she loved the baby so much that she was willing to be wronged for the sake of the child, and therefore Solomon knew it's obvious that that woman is the mother. But like Jam said, she was just going to keep lying and lying. I mean, he could have brought the sword out and then pointed it at the mothers and be like, okay, now tell the story again. Now I got a sword. Now who's the mother? They would have said the same thing. The one woman would have said the same thing because she was telling the truth. The other woman would have said the same thing because she was lying and she was going to keep lying, whatever it took to get out of this with the live baby. But once he said, cut the baby in half, the woman who was telling the truth didn't keep telling the same story, because there's no reason to tell that anymore. She said, I don't want the baby anymore. Let her have the baby. And that was it. So Solomon, I don't think there was any other possible scenario that would have resulted in such a quick revelation of who the mother was but that. So that is what Solomon, what gained him a reputation for being so wise, at least started it. Yeah, Wayne?
I'd like to know what the ulterior motives were of the other woman, because obviously she had to love the child when she said, let it be divided or killed. She was more interested in pleasing the king for some reason than she was that lie.
Well, she thought she might get away with it, I guess. Then when she didn't get away with it, it was not.
Yeah.
What she had to do, that's what she had to do.
Yeah, I guess she tried all she could to try to get the baby, but now that she saw that wasn't possible, she's trying to save herself, I guess. Like, go ahead. She's going to take her. She'd rather let that baby die than to admit that she lied. You see, there's the thing. When she said, okay, let the baby die, now she's just looking out for herself, because she could have said, no, I take it back. I was lying the whole time. I accidentally smothered my baby and I stole hers. But then the sword would have been on her then. So she, again, from start to finish, and the laying on her baby, total accident. I mean, she didn't murder her baby on purpose. That was an accident. But everything she did after that was pure evil. So very quickly, here's a couple applications. We must obey God in everything. All things. Solomon's described as one who loved Jehovah, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. That's important because it shows that love demands obedience. It points out also that he wasn't perfect. But love for Jehovah, true love for Jehovah, is connected with walking in the statutes of David his father. 1 John 5:3, John said, this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. Jesus said in John 14:15, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. John 14:21, whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. John 14:23 and 24, if anyone loves me, he'll keep my word. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words. So 3 or 4 times in succession, Jesus, right there in John 14, says, love me equals keep my commandments. We must obey God in all things. And secondly, God is willing to provide wisdom to his people when they ask. He was then. He did with Solomon. But he's still willing. James said, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God, because he'll give it to you. He gives liberally, generously, and without reproach. So if you lack wisdom, ask God. So a couple ways you can ask God. You can ask God the way Solomon asked God, or you can ask God right here. Because this is the wisdom you'll get. The wisdom that you can get from God is already in here. But James says you can ask God actually, directly. And He'll give it to you because He gives liberally and generously to everybody, all His people, is the implication, without reproach.